What's that? I am. That's right. Y'all sleep separately as well as you can together. This may be all we have. We may not have any tonight because a lot of the kids are at camp. Parents too. The parents that do come in are probably teaching whatever kids are left. Looks like Steve and Michelle. You're supposed to sit in the back. I guess so. You lead some prayer, James? No. Okay. Hey, Barry, you want to lead us in a prayer before we start? I'll sing first, and then we'll do prayer. That sound good? All right. Let's see. Yes. Barry. Mm-hmm. Let's see. I remember the number. I'll turn to it. Maybe. Well, I'd be wrong. All right. 108. 108. Mm-hmm. I don't have anything other than allergies, so let me freak you out. Number 108. God is the fountain whence 10,000 blessings flow. To him my life, my health, and friends, and every good I owe. The comfort he affords on neither few nor small. He is the source of fresh delights, my portion and my own. He fills my heart with joy, my lips are tuned for praise, and to his glory I'll devote the remnant of my days. Okay, Barry.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. It's time now we have to come together and study and worship the word. We pray, Father, that you be with us tonight. Once camp, have a safe and enjoyable time. Truth be spread. We pray for the sick tonight. Watch over them and return to them. Continue with us now throughout the remainder of this study. Be with us always. Forgive us for our sins. Through the blood of your Son, Jesus, in whose blessed name we pray.
So the overall theme of the summer series is a man after God's own heart. So we're going to talk about Jezebel tonight. All right, now part of it is because I like curveballs. Part of it is in deference to other people who become behind me speaking, probably about the same, 4 or 5 handful of guys. So, but also because the Bible teaches us 2 ways, right? Usually positively, this is what righteousness looks like. But he also teaches us negatively, which is this is not what righteousness looks like, right? So, and it's going to be a 2-for-1 because you can't talk about Jezebel without talking about who? Ahab. Okay, they're partners in crime, and I think we get this idea of Ahab that he's somehow this passenger in Jezebel's vehicle, and she's the the mastermind. Now, is she manipulative and is she ambitious and all that kind of good stuff? Yes, she is. But Ahab is not some wallflower, and he had his own mind and some other things. We'll talk about that stuff. So I think there's some preconceived notions about Ahab and maybe letting him off the hook, and Jezebel's driving everything, but they both had their flaws. They both had their strengths. Some of them actually had a little bit of compunctions of morality from time to time. Okay, not Jezebel. We don't have to read about her, but Ahab did. We'll talk about that, and we're going to start off talking about the area where they came from, who they are, because I think it makes a big difference to know why they operated the way they did, because you need to know the setting they come from, right? These people aren't just, whipped up out of nowhere. They have no family life or no back history or backstory. And so, like any good movie, especially if you're like Marvel comic book fan like I am, they'll have the overall movie, and then they'll go back and they'll tell the origin story, right? Why? Because it fleshes out that character. So we're going to talk about where they came from, the cities they came from, fathers, parentage, setting they came from. And then we'll get into what they did. And then we'll get into what those character points are. And then we'll make some observations about, hopefully we have time. Maybe we may run out of time after the first part. But, and try to make observations to us today about what those character points, the bad ones are, and that the man of God should look totally different from that, right? Okay, so Tyre and Sidon. You might need me to put this on. Can anybody hear me? Because if not, I ain't gonna put this on. Okay. You can hear. Okay. All right. I'll try not to stray. Tyre and Sidon. Anybody know anything? They were coastal cities. Wicked cities. Okay. What else? Anybody know anything else? Want them to start with a T? Want them to start with it? They were prosperous. That's right. Very prosperous. All right. So everybody know where they're at? So you've got Galilee, which is what? Northern Israel. So we're talking about two different places tonight. Judah, which stayed true to God, right? Mostly. There were some good kings back, but at least they had some good kings. But Israel was what? They went off into apostasy from the get-go, right? So, he made one at Dan and Bethel, 2 golden calves, immediately started idolatrous worship at the kingdom split up. Okay, so, but the kingdom of Judah at least had some good kings and sometimes didn't stray away from God, right? So, let's start off with Tyre, okay? So here's a map, a little blow-up map. I should have got it on PowerPoint. But this is in the northern part of the coastline, right? What we know as Phoenicia. So you'd have Judah and then Israel, the northern kingdoms, and then above it was Phoenicia, right? And so Tyre was the southernmost of those, and it was the second oldest of these two cities. These two cities are combined by fate and by rulership, right? So if it says it was a king of Sidon, it was also usually a king of what? Sidon and Tyre. If it was a king of Tyre, it was also usually a king of Tyre and Sidon, because these things were joined at the hip. In fact, this was a work started from Bremen, so we were kind of like a sister congregation from Bremen. Well, Tyre was kind of started by the same folks who originally settled Sidon, which was above it. Okay, and Tyre was world famous for craftsmen, and in fact, they had a good relationship with the children of Israel, from David's kingdom, Solomon's kingdom. The king Hiram the first, it said that he loved David. Okay, and when it came about time for Solomon to build the temple, guess where he got a lot of his precious metals and ornate craftsmanship done, and who furnished those for him? Hiram the first. Said he was very, very, very skilled at all kind of crafted items, gold and silver and ivory and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so a lot of the things that were made for the temple, brass works, all that kind of stuff, he helped make those and ship some of the goods down there to Solomon. So they had a good working relationship, at least as far as being allied when it came to trade, right? And usually if you're allied with somebody in trade, more likely you're not going to do what? You're not going to ruin it, go to war, right? So they remained peaceful with each other most of the time, at least while Hiram was around. So, and they were famous for also something else you might remember, purple dye. There was a specific kind of mollusk that was around there that produced a purple pigment, and they were world famous for that. It was very rare, and so if it was very rare, it also meant it was very what? Which means who could afford it? That's right, royalty. So it became known as the color purple became known as the color of rich people, royalty, okay, specifically. So if Tyre was famous for all kind of craft and workmen, It was a neat kind of city setup. So it was just part of it was on the coast and part of it was off an island right off the coast. And eventually and it was a walled city, the part that was off the coast. It was very defensible. And eventually they filled up a walkway between the two parts of the city state where they would have like a central meeting place between those two places. And it was a beautiful city. It was diverse, as they like to call it. People from all over the world were there, especially if you were a craftsman and you wanted to hone your crafts. You probably came from all over Phoenicia, maybe even from Israel, from Assyria, from Damascus. Okay, so it had a lot of people over there. But it was an idolatrous. Even Hiram the first, even though he was a good working relationship with Israel and with Judah and sent them supplies and he loved David, they were still what? Idolaters. Okay, it says that from the jump. All right, now Sidon was also like them, famous for trade, famous for brass works, famous for glass, for blown glass, all that kind of stuff, and also really famous for their navy. In fact, that area between Tyre and Sidon was even mentioned in the Iliad and the Odyssey about how great their worksmen and craftsmanship were. So it was world famous, right? So, you know, if Homer's writing about you and Homer's books are all over the known world at the time, then guess what? Everybody knows about you. Their navy was very famous, and they had held off for years, several different people. Eventually, Assyria would make them either, you know, go to the sword or pay tribute. They eventually became a tributary of Assyria, nation of Assyria. And, but pretty much left their own devices because they produced a lot of good stuff. Nobody wanted to mess with the trade routes that were going through there and the goods they produced for all these other countries. So they were very rich. They're very cosmopolitan. A lot of them were probably very well educated because you got craftsmen anywhere. I mean, a lot of that stuff, you know, even arches, making arches. I mean, you've seen some of these, even the old, you know, 11th century buildings and monasteries from them right after the Middle Ages in Europe. I mean, there's a lot of math that goes into those arches. There's a lot of, you know, a lot of fine detail work and precision work. And if you're working with alloys and metals, guess what? You got to know what you're doing. And a lot of that's taught. Okay, so it was cosmopolitan, it was rich, it was cultured comparatively. You know, we probably think of them as a little barbarous, but you know, compared to the goat farmers out there, they were, you know, they were rich in culture. So that's the setting that Jezebel comes from. Okay, now her father was called Ithbaal, right? And he had an interesting history. So he helped overthrow the king that was before him, and he was actually the high priest of two main religious bodies. One was the priest of Baal, and the other one was Astarte. Okay, I don't know how exactly they pronounce it, but Astarte or Astarte, whatever, how you want to pronounce it. But okay, one of them was the god of fertility and production and nature, and also war. That was the female goddess that they had. And the other one was Baal. Now, the specific type of Baal just means Lord. Okay, that's all it means. So it could be, so if you ever see like Baal Zebub, that was Lord of the flies. Okay, Baal Peor, Lord of the opening. Okay, but it just says in this account, it just says Baal. But when you do a little bit of digging, there was a guy by the name of, I'll tell you. I bring this up because it comes into play later. Melquart, Melquart. All right. So this guy was supposedly the Lord of the universe and Lord of the underworld and protector of the known world. And I don't know if you know much about deities and demigods in ancient history, but a lot of these things get intermingled with each other, and it's what they call syncretic, right? So you're kind of weaving. So one culture may have somebody that looks a lot like somebody else's Zeus, and they're like, oh, that's kind of like Zeus. Well, Melkart was kind of like Hercules in a lot of ways. And so actually in some of the old reports, they would say that this was they built a temple to Heracles there in Tyre and Sidon. Okay. So he was kind of synonymous in that area. If you didn't know who Melkart was, he was closely related to, he's kind of like Heracles. Okay. So those were the two main idolatrous practices in that city. Okay. Now, her father was priest, king. Okay. And so he controlled what we would consider the two pillars of civilization. Okay. If people don't fear the law, they probably are superstitious and they'll fear God, right? And so if you have control of both, guess what you have control over 99% of the people, right? So her dad was priest king Tyre and Sidon, and she followed right along her daddy's footsteps. Okay. And we'll learn about that as we read these scriptures. So that's the backstory, the back setting of where Jezebel's coming out of. Okay. Anybody got any questions or observations or anything you want to throw in there? Okay. Ahab, who's this guy? Anybody remember? It's off the top of your head. It's all right. Not gonna be a test. That was her husband. That's a sneaky answer, but yes, it's also great. Okay. So he was king of the northern kingdom, what we consider Israel. So Judah, Israel. Okay. His backstory is there was a lot of kings that got knocked off in rapid succession before his daddy came on the scene. His daddy name was Omri. And before Omri came on the scene, there were a lot of kings that came coming and going pretty quick. One lasted 2 years, and then God prophesied that that guy was going to be knocked off the throne by Zimri. Zimri knocked him off the throne, overthrew him. He lasted about 7 days. When the people found out that he'd killed the other king, they didn't like it that much. And they talked to this guy named Omri, which is Ahab's daddy. And he was a captain of the host. And he went in and did a military coup. Okay. So he had one other person that was trying to vie for the throne at the same time who saw some opportunity. He's able to conquer him. And so Omri, which is Ahab's daddy, was sole ruler of kingdom of Israel for about 12, 14 years. And so they had a little bit of peace then. Okay. So you see a couple things that already they have in common between Jezebel and Ahab. They kind of cut from the same cloth and had very similar backstories. But Omri, it said, was also an idolater. Okay. So he did the same thing that Jeroboam did before him. And in fact, let's go over to 1 Kings 16. And if somebody wants to read verse 23 through 28. 1 Kings 16, 23 through 28.
In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, began Omri to reign over Israel 12 years. 6 years reigned he in Tirzah. And he bought the hill Samaria of Shemar for 2 talents of silver, and built on the hill, and called the name of the city which he built, after the name Shemar, owner of the hill Samaria. But Omri wrought evil in the eyes of the Lord, and did worse than all that were before him. For he walked in all the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin, to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger with their vanities. Now the rest of the acts of Omri which he did, and his might that he shewed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Omri slept with his fathers, and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son reigned in his stead.
All right. So that's the daddy of Ahab. That leads us into Ahab. Okay. So I wrote down some comparisons between these two characters as far as starting out. And, in a lot of ways, it was a bad marriage because you married Jezebel, not a great pick. But of course, Ahab, not being the catch himself. So, all right. Other than being a king, that's great. But they had a lot of similarity as far as their background goes. And so I want to point this out because later on we'll go and people think that, Ahab's just along for the ride. No, Ahab isn't just along for the ride. He's a shrewd character in his own regard. So we're going to talk about both of them. But here's some similarities I wrote down between Ahab and Jezebel. Okay. Both of them were children of royalty. Okay. Had that in common. Both of them were child of privilege. If you're a child of royalty, you were also what? Had the best tutors, had the best food, had the best makeup, had the best everything. Okay. Both parents overthrew their previous kingdom ruler. Okay. That's going to come into play in the mindset of these two people because they're not used to being told what. We're in charge. If we're not in charge, guess what? We'll make sure we get in charge. Okay. They were both politically shrewd. Being politically wise is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Knowing that the kingdom down the street wants to come in overnight and kill all my folks, might want to be wise to that, right? Making alliances with people so you're not in wars all the time, not necessarily bad. Okay, how you do those things is really important. Your motivations behind doing those things are very important. But these kids were brought up under two people. One, coalesced power, both religious and military. Ethbaal, which is Jezebel's daddy. And then Omri had the first long period of peace that was other than his son that would ever be in Israel, as far as the longest lasting periods of any kind of stability in the kingdom of Israel before they're taken away into Syrian captivity. Okay, so his daddy was politically shrewd. Okay, if you're king in Israel after the last two guys lasted 2 years and 7 days, doing something right as far as trying to keep your kingdom in order. So both these kids grew up under folks who knew what they were doing when it came to taking over, controlling, and running the kingdom. Okay, so let's keep that in your mindset when you're dealing with these two characters. They're both ambitious. Okay, Ahab, he was not. Okay, everybody thinks of Ahab in the part in 1 Kings 21 where, and we'll talk about it, where he's sulking over the fact that he can't buy Naboth's vineyard from him, and Jezebel comes in. I'll get it for you, honey. Right? Paraphrasing. And so you think he's some whipped, henpecked husband. No, not really. When you study about Ahab, in that regard, you see a compunction of conscience. That doesn't mean that he was a pushover or that his wife was necessarily running the show. Did she tempt him to sin? Yes. Was Ahab a man? Did he have full faculties? Okay. So who's making decisions for Ahab? In the final analysis, who? Ahab. Okay, now, that's like us. We can be tempted to sin, right? We can have bad friendships. We can have bad ideas. We can have whatever else kind of pressures we got on us. But in the final analysis, who makes me sin? Okay, so don't let Ahab off the hook or think that he's some kind of pushover, because we're really about some of his exploits. All right, both of them were ambitious. He was a great builder. He expanded his territory, held off Damascus militarily, twice via defensive maneuvers, once going and taking Damascus and capturing their king. He grew up under a daddy who was a captain of the guard who took over Israel. Do you think somebody taught him about military matters? Yes. And then he showed that he was very shrewd in military matters because he held off Damascus. Was politically shrewd in that he married what? Jezebel, which tied him to his northern neighbor of wealth and shipping and peace, right? And he also sent his daughter by Jezebel down to the southern kingdom, Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram, Athaliah, and married him and had peace on his southern border. So Ahab wasn't stupid, okay? And Ahab was not a pushover. So I think we need to kind of have a more well-rounded view than some people I think have of this character. Okay, so both parents, we were talking about this, orchestrated a long, stable rule of their kingdoms, and both parents were idolaters. Okay, so into this backstory, we have our two characters. Okay, that tells you a little more about Jezebel and Ahab. Why do they do the things they did? Okay, well, if you're a child of privilege who's an idolater, but who's shrewd politically, your main motivation, if you're Ahab, is to do what? Rule as long as you can. Right? Keep the kingdom peaceful as you can and build up as much wealth as you can and make it work for as long as you can and sit back in your vineyard down there in Jezreel and live a good life. Okay? And he wanted to be known as a great builder and as a great ruler. And he actually was able to make peace eventually by capturing his rival to the east out of Damascus. And he should have done what God told him to do with that evil king, but he did not. So he ran afoul of God again, idolatry, and then not listen to him later on. But they eventually were able to keep an alliance and actually push back Assyria when Assyria was weakened. So this guy, okay, but they were both idolaters. Okay. So what'd they do? Everybody knows the story, probably most of it by heart. So Ahab, let's just read it. Let's go down and let's start right after the verse that we just read. And let's read verse 29 through 33. 1 Kings 16, 29 through 33.
In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri became king over Israel. Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel and Samaria 22 years. Now Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And it came to pass, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him.
Let's take just a break right here. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. It keeps being referred to this over and over and over and over. All right. First king of Israel, divided kingdom, period. What's the first thing he did? One of the first things he did to coalesce his power. Something similar to that to Jezebel's daddy did. Built idols. 2 golden calves, one in Dan, one in Bethel, because he didn't want them going down to what? Jerusalem and getting some real religion. Essentially, I mean, that's exactly what he said. I don't want them going down there, starting to worship God the right way again and forget all about me, and then they're going to come up here and clean house because what? I'm an idolater. I'm not doing what God wants me to do. So if they have a couple easy places to worship just down the road, guess what? Less likely to go down to Jerusalem and get some of that real religion. So when it talks about that, I just want to stop there. So if we keep reading it, we know what his original sin was, which was idolatry. Okay, go ahead. Sorry, Ricky.
Then he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made a wooden image. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him.
All right. So what did you do?
It's almost like there's a competition for everybody to be worse than the one before them.
Well, I mean, science and civilization are like that in some ways, in both positive and negative aspects, right? So, you don't go from, clubbing muskrats to clothe yourself to the moon overnight. So it's a steady layer upon layer of building off what somebody else did the generation before you, right? And learning and knowledge and everything else. Okay. So, science, technology, civilizations work like that. We learn how to do concrete. Okay. We build a buildings. Okay. How are we going to feed these people? Oh, we can grow this crop here. Right. So, but the same way can be talked about in a downward spiral when it comes to what? Morality. This guy's sin, he moves the mark. Well, Barry's a machinist. He's a perfect person to talk about this. Okay. He works with standards, or used to. Now you don't have to worry about that. Now you don't have one standard. That's fine. That's fine. We won't get into that one. But you have standards, right? As a machinist. And if you want those parts to fit on those machines you're fixing, guess what? You keep getting off at, you keep warbling off at a little bit. Next time, how far off is it going to get? Twice as far. Let it keep going, 3 times as far. Doesn't take long. Okay. Beyond the pale, I talked about this in many classes before. Back in old cities, back in medieval England, or wherever else, they would have these white stones or white ground markers on the outside of cities, and that told you what? Where the edge of the city was. Okay. And so metaphorically, to go beyond the pale, we use that all the time. At least I do. Maybe I'm kind of old. But it means to go past what is socially or morally correct. We've gone beyond the pale. Okay. So you keep moving those yard marks every generation. Guess what? How do you get from Adam and Eve to Noah? Little by little. Okay. All right. So, but he started what? Everybody thinks the priest of Baal, but they forget the second part, and I was kind of mystified after reading this through again, how obvious it is. But there were 2 idolatry, sets of idolatry going on simultaneously. There were 450 priests of Baal, but there were also 400 priests of Astarte, right? Okay. So this Ishtar, as she would be commingled with in Babylon and parts of the east, this goddess of fertility and production and all this other kind of stuff, right? There was temple prostitution, all that kind of stuff was going on in these things. But it says he built what? Temple to Baal, but he also built groves to who? Asherah, okay? So the root of that word is actually tree, okay, these groves. So what they would have is you'd either have a large tree, because in the ancient world, they thought, man, we shouldn't keep our gods. They don't like it being cooped up in these buildings, which is funny. Because you think if they were a deity enough to, protect the universe and, the underworld and, cause reproduction to happen, they could turn a handle on the door and get outside. But they thought it was bad to keep these gods in buildings, and so they would make them a grove, right? Be outside with these trees. So it could either be an altar built inside a grove of trees, or they would plant a grove of trees and put an altar in front of it, or the tree could be the altar, and they would make graven images on the tree. Okay, so the root of this word and these groves they built, okay, has meaning behind it. And so you're thinking, oh, he just built a temple to Baal. No, they built a lot of temples out in the woods all over the place, because in the scriptures you'll see this over and over and over. On every green hill, under every tree, you've what? You've done your whoredoms. Okay, you'll see that over and over in the Old Testament. Isaiah, Kings. Okay, and so when you got 400 priests of this other goddess, little g, right? What's she trying to do? They trying to take over the country. Here, already got it militarily, but she's coming in and doing what? Like her daddy did before her. And it wasn't good enough, you got his gods. And Ahab let this go on because, he thought that all these things could commingle and be fine, but the only problem is Jehovah is a what? Jealous God. And he will have how many gods before him? None, because guess how many gods actually exist other than Jehovah? Nobody. Okay, so you have a problem. This metropolitan girl coming in and thinking it's gonna work down here in these these country bumpkins. It won't take long to proselytize them, right? And she used the oldest tricks in the book, right? Which was, I remember the special forces agent who was in counterinsurgency warfare. He said, you can get most people to do anything you want 3 different ways. Sexual immorality, drugs, and donuts, because money's a given. Okay, so right. So those are the 3 main things. Well, what did you have? You had temple prostitution. You had a different god, right? So if we want to be religious, hey, you can be religious. If you want to be sexually immoral and think you're religious, hey, you can do that too. Or in the case of Naboth, where he wanted to buy his vineyard, Naboth couldn't sell his vineyard because of why? That's right. So there were 2 promises given. There was a seed promise, Christ, and there was a land promise. And that land promise was supposed to stay in those families in perpetuity. Your brothers could buy it, right? But guess where it wasn't going? Somebody else that wasn't your family. And so he was morally obligated to keep that within his family. And so when Ahab sulks about it later on, you actually see one of the few times in Ahab that he has any kind of moral compunction at all, because he himself didn't try to take the guy's land. He went and sulked about it, okay? Because he knew it was illegal to take the guy's land. And it was illegal for the guy to sell it to him, because he'd be in trouble with God, and so would Ahab. Okay, so, but she's trying through these idolatry practices, not just in a small scale. I mean, she comes in both barrels blazing. If you want a female deity, I got that for you. If you want a male deity, got that for you too, right? So, you see what she's trying to do? I mean, it's not just there's a temple here and the 450 guys are going to stay there and offer practices to Baal there every year, all year long. They're going out in the country. It's going countrywide. You understand what I'm saying? So you understand why it was such a problem. So, all right, there's the first one. Let's go down to 1 Kings 18 and verse 13. So here we see, if you won't do it voluntarily through religion, and you go against them, then you're going to see the state. And so what did she do? What did Jezebel do? Kills the prophets. Got competition? Jezebel don't have no problem with it, does she? Her only problem is, by killing those prophets, it doesn't remove the God from heaven. Right? But she's used to dealing with gods that she knows very well are not deities. Okay? I mean, any reasonable human being knows that, the little idol I've got up on my mantle ain't coming off of there and doing nothing. Not happening. And so she's very used to dealing with, guess what? False gods. She's feeding her up on a real one. Okay, so she's a murderer, right? All right, let's go see what else. Let's go to 1 Kings 19 and verses 1 and 2. So this is after the account of Mount Carmel. I will say one thing about the account of Mount Carmel that I overread sometimes. Where was it? Let's get down here and see. Okay, here it is. Somebody read 1 Kings 18, verse 19. Sorry, I didn't want to skip that part. We'll make a point here and then move on. 1 Kings 18, 19. I don't know why I've read this over and over and over and over, but we always get fixated on the 450 priests of Baal. But there's 400 other people there who are also prophets of the other deity. I don't know how many years I've just, the priests of Baal, and he destroyed the priests of Baal. All these guys got done in. Okay, so when he goes down here and he does the troll job, is what I call it. Everybody knows what a troll is in internet culture. That's where you're trying to get somebody riled up and make them mad by making fun of them, right? So in the modern equivalent, if you like the Hawks, they're playing tonight. When you get home, you can watch them. But they just beat the team before them, and one of the guys was trying to roughshod some of our players. And so after we won, this is what you call a troll job. John Collins wore a T-shirt of him slam dunking over the guy that was giving problems. Okay, so that's next level trash talking, right? Okay. Well, I always found this is always funny because God's got all the power in the universe, and these guys think that they're in the cosmopolitan center of the world, and they got the king on their side. And what does he say? Oh, yeah. Verse 27, I'll read this. And it came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, "Cry loud, for he's a god." Either he's talking or pursuing him. Maybe he's on a journey, or peradventure he sleeps and must be awakened. Now, what's cool about that statement is, and I didn't know it, still started doing some more research, is that this Baal, who we just read Baal, but if you go out and figure out it's Melkarth, actually had cycles of birth, death, and rebirth, okay? And also he would go off and do Herculean adventures, right? Going around the world doing feats of strength and, Anyway, so when he's saying this, I mean, they know exactly, that tells you a little about, he knows exactly which deity that he's insulting. And, well, not deity, I mean, obviously it's a false god, but, I mean, it's just hysterical. I mean, when you read this account, that God's totally in control. His prophet knows that they have no trump card, no God's coming to save them, right? And he's just laying it out there. It's awesome. Anyway. Yeah. They're going into hiding after this, but she's not going to kill them. And then God's going to have the last laugh. That's right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, no. Neither of them are coming. And one of her domains was the god of war, too. I mean, she was a warrior goddess. Anyway, so let's keep on going. Okay, so after this account, then we pick up in chapter 19, verses 1 and 2. Somebody read that. 1 Kings 19, 1, 2. All right. We also talked about Naboth, right? The vineyard he had in Jezreel, which is right up against the property that Ahab had. Ahab wanted it, couldn't get it legally. His wife did what? Had two folks of Belial, which is another false god, set up. They didn't have a problem with lying because guess what? Belial was the god of lies. Okay, so didn't have a problem with giving false testimony, getting this guy stoned, and then gave the land to him. Okay. All right, so we'll stop here because we only got a few minutes to make some points, right? I think you know the rest of the story, where his entire lineage wiped out, dogs licked the blood out of the chariots, right? And then anybody who was on his side got killed. And then we'll talk about one more thing with Jezebel. Okay, when they came for her, right? It was prophesied that you weren't gonna find there won't be nothing left of her, right? I mean, she's gonna be trampled underfoot and fed to the dogs. Literally, it wasn't metaphorical. It happened, right? So Jehu comes up. He said, if anybody's with me, push her out the window. Push her out the window. He goes in, have something to eat, and talk with the folks who are still there. And he said, yeah, okay, y'all go bury her because at least she's a king's daughter. And there wasn't nothing left over but what? Palms, skull. All right. It makes me wonder if she wasn't clutching something so tightly. What was she clutching? Was it a little idol? I don't know. It's interesting to think about. But what's one of the things she did as he's coming up to him? And she vindictively says, let's say, let me turn over here. I'll read this part just so I can get it done real quick. Over in 2 Kings 9. Okay, here it is. I'm going to read 2 Kings 9 and start at verse 30. And when Jehu, this is the guy who's prophesied, who's going to carry out the judgment on Jezebel. And when Jehu came to Jezebel, Jezebel heard of it. Jezebel heard of it. And she painted her face and tired her head and looked out a window. She was also vain. She was a priestess to the end. So, two things are going to happen. Two things people think probably here is either she's trying to seduce this guy. I don't think it's very likely. Or she's just talking trash to him at the end. She's not afraid of him, and she's going to go out with the same vindictive spirit she came in with. Okay, that was Jezebel. All right, but she put on makeup like she's going to a funeral. Thinks she's probably going to get a royal death and probably laid in state, and she'd at least be a martyr to her people or something. And she looked out the window, and then she talks trash to him before the end. And as Jehu entered in at the gate, she said, had Zimri peace who slew his master? And we just talked about that account. Zimri lasted 7 days after he overthrew his master, and then Omri overtook him, and that was Ahab's daddy. So she was telling him essentially, you think you're going to have any peace after killing me? And he lifted up his face to the window, and who's on my side? And they threw her down. All right. So let's look at some character traits and what not to do. Murder, not a good thing, right? That's right off the top. Let's just get that out of the way. Murder, not a good thing to do. But long before you ever kill somebody, there's a lot of steps mentally you got to go through, right? You got to hate. You got to plan it. You got to stew on it for a while. Don't let your anger turn into wrath, and don't what, right? Don't let the sun go down in your wrath. Okay, so there's a lot of baby steps, like we talked about civilization going this way. A lot of baby steps get along that point, right? All those little sins that build up to the big ones, what we consider the big ones, all of them are bad. But, and then what else? She was proud, obviously. Vindictive. Why'd she kill the other priest? Cement her power. They both wanted control. She was power hungry, obviously. Sexually immoral. Some of these things that happen, they would have priestesses who would do what? Do that for money. Whether or not she actually did any of that, I don't know, but she was fine with it happening. Manipulator, obviously, tempted her husband to sin when he didn't do it to begin with. She suborned perjury. What does that mean? When you get somebody else to lie on your behalf in a court of law. Okay, that's a felony, even today. So let's look at Ahab. He wasn't satisfied. The Bible talks about that, right? Be content. Contentment will save you from a whole lot of trouble. Ahab, for all his good traits, and he did have some, right? He did have some. He wasn't satisfied, and he got him in some trouble, right? Wasn't satisfied with the land he had, with what God told him to do with the evil king. Okay. Who do they trust in? Ahab trusted in his alliances and his kingship. Jezebel trusted in what? Her mostly, and in her allegiances to the twin powers of Tyre and Sidon. Compromise his faith for political power. Compromise your faith for anything, it's bad news, right? So, it's one thing, and he had peer pressures like everybody did. He wanted to remain in charge, and he wanted to look good to his friends and the kingdom of Judah to the south and the metropolitan folks to the north. And we can be that same way at work or at school, wherever else. We're not above falling in the same trap Ahab's fell into, or the Jezebels of the world fell into, if we're not careful. Married badly. So, kids, choose a good one. Vain. Both of them were a little vain, weren't they? One was very vain. There's an historical account where they might have found Ahab's palace of ivory, and in it were several small bowls with smaller holes in them for makeup. Might have been hers, don't know. Just interesting. They found that in Samaria, the Hill Palace. All right. You make any questions or observations or sit down, shut uppers? Thank you. Enjoyed it. That's fine. Who's doing announcements? Anybody?